Somewhere toward the end of the 1960s, something quiet began to change in American homes. It didn't arrive suddenly. There were no announcements, no warnings, no clear moment anyone could point to years later and say, "That's when it started." The same kitchens were still there, the same tables, the same chairs pulled out every evening. Everything looked familiar. But the rhythm was different. More televisions appeared, not just in living rooms, but close enough to be heard from the kitchen. Sometimes they weren't even being watched. They simply filled the space. Dinners that once centered around conversation slowly began to share attention with screens. Plates were still full, carefully prepared and served on time. But attention was divided. By the early 1970s, many families were eating together less often, not because they didn't care, but because life itself was speeding up. Mothers began working outside the home more frequently. Fathers' workdays stretched longer, often into the evening. Children's schedules filled with activities that hadn't existed a generation earlier. Everyone was moving. Everyone was adjusting. Meals didn't disappear. They adapted. Casseroles became quicker. Preparation times shortened. Frozen foods quietly appeared in freezers. Shortcuts were no longer frowned upon. They were necessary. What was lost first wasn't flavor. It was time. Time to sit without watching the clock. Time to talk without interruption. Time to let dinner be the center of the evening instead of something squeezed between responsibilities. By the mid-1970s, something quiet had settled into American homes. Not excitement, not optimism, endurance. Families weren't chasing happiness anymore. They were protecting stability. And food became one of the last places where that stability still lived. Even grocery shopping felt different. You walked into stores knowing prices might change again. You compared brands carefully. You chose what you trusted, not what looked new. Coupons mattered. Sales mattered. Nothing went into the cart without a reason. Many families used the same grocery list for years, not because they lacked imagination, but because those foods had already proven themselves. They filled bellies. They stretched. They didn't fail. In many kitchens, the refrigerator told the real story of the decade. Leftovers stacked neatly, plastic containers without matching lids, foil-wrapped plates waiting patiently for tomorrow. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed. Meals were planned around what already existed. Monday might be soup. Tuesday, reheated stew. Wednesday, something built quietly from what remained. Cooking wasn't a fresh start each night. It was continuation. And that continuity mattered, because the outside world felt unpredictable. Gas lines, inflation, news that rarely felt reassuring. Inside the house, dinner was the one thing that still arrived on time. Children learned this rhythm without ever being taught. They knew when to set the table. They knew when to stay out of the kitchen. They knew when the lid stayed on the pot, and why. Rules weren't written. They were absorbed. A bubbling pot meant patience. A closed oven meant anticipation. Time moved slower around food. Even the sounds mattered. The clink of utensils, the scrape of chairs, the low hum of tired conversation after a long day. Televisions were sometimes on, but not always watched. Dinner wasn't entertainment. It was grounding. In many homes, fathers came home exhausted. Mothers stayed standing long after everyone else sat down. Children ate quickly, then slowly. There was no rush to clear the table, because once dinner ended, the day truly felt finished. Food marked the boundary between effort and rest. And in the 1970s, rest was earned. Certain meals became emotional anchors. Meatloaf meant predictability. Soup meant security. Pasta meant stretching the week just a little further. Even breakfast reflected this mindset. Eggs, toast, oatmeal. Nothing flashy, Nothing optional. You ate what was there. You started the day. Lunches were packed with the same quiet care. Sandwiches wrapped tightly, fruit chosen carefully, notes written briefly, if at all. Food wasn't used to express emotion. It expressed responsibility. As the decade moved on, convenience continued to creep in. Boxed meals, frozen dinners, shortcuts that promised relief. But many families used them cautiously, not out of pride, but out of habit. New things weren't trusted immediately. They had to earn a place at the table, and many never did. Sunday still felt different, even when money was tight, even when portions were smaller. Sunday meals carried weight. They signaled pause, togetherness, recognition that the week had been survived. Food didn't need to impress. It needed to gather. Hands still did the work. Hands peeled, chopped, stirred, and lifted heavy pots from the stove. Recipes lived in memory, not on screens. Measurements weren't written down. They were felt. You knew something was ready by sound, by smell, by instinct. Kitchens weren't silent places. They creaked, they hummed, they carried the rhythm of daily life. A drawer opening meant dinner was close. A wooden spoon tapping the pot meant patience. A chair scraping the floor meant someone had finally arrived home. Children learned the world through these moments. They learned that waiting had purpose, that meals didn't appear instantly. That effort came before reward. They learned that some things couldn't be rushed. Even cleanup carried meaning. Dishes stacked in the sink, hands dried with worn towels, leftovers wrapped carefully, not because they were special, but because they mattered. Food was never treated as disposable. Throwing something away felt wrong. It felt careless, because food had already cost time, and time was something no one felt they had extra of. In many homes, the kitchen light stayed on longer than any other room. It was the last place to go dark at night. Mothers stood there alone sometimes, after everyone else had gone quiet. Fathers lingered a few extra minutes at the table, not speaking. Children drifted off with full bellies and predictable dreams. The kitchen held the day together until the very end. And that sense of closure is something many people still search for today. We eat faster now. We eat distracted. We eat surrounded by noise that doesn't belong to us. But something inside still remembers what it felt like when a meal meant the day was complete. The 1970s didn't erase those memories. They layered over them. Old habits met new pressures. Old values met a faster world. Some traditions bent, some cracked, some survived quietly. And the ones that survived became anchors. People carried them forward without realizing it. They cooked the same soup their mother once made, even if they couldn't explain why. They insisted on certain meals during hard times, even when money wasn't the issue anymore. Comfort didn't come from taste alone. It came from recognition, from knowing, without thinking, that this meal once meant safety, and still could. That's why these memories don't fade. They wait. They sit quietly until something small brings them back. Steam on a window, toast browning, onions softening in a pan. Suddenly, you're not remembering. You're home. And that return matters, because it reminds people that stability once existed and can exist again, even if it looks different now. These meals didn't promise happiness. They promised presence. They promised that, at least once a day, everyone would arrive in the same place. And in a decade full of uncertainty, that promise was everything. So before you go, take a moment. What meal always appeared when everything else felt unsure? What dish made the house feel steady again? Share it in the comments, because these memories deserve space. And if this kind of quiet nostalgia speaks to you, make sure to like the video and subscribe to AmeriRetro. This channel exists to remember the everyday things that held us together, and to keep those memories alive together.